Hi, I'm Christian MALYCHA. I'm art historian and exhibition maker, and for Galerie Max Hetzler I've curated the exhibition Bed and Clock, Moon and Beach on Edvard Munch. It's a group exhibition that spans 5 generations and about 150 years of painterly and human existence, and as the title implies, it takes Edvard Munch as its starting point. Taking a look at the 20th century, Edvard Munch is the foremost painter of the big tale of life and death, of hope and despair, of the individual amidst an unclear, uncertain reality, and an individual that's struggling or strongly trying to find its own place in the world we're faced with. All human emotions and feelings, the encounters, seem to slip away or lose themselves in the immaterial realm of the digital. Edvard Munch might be a point of reference for a really human or physical experience. A psychological one, an emotional one, an experience of people coming together, of people meeting, of closeness, of doing things together, of hoping and trying to make their living together. And so Max Hetzler and I thought, actually 2 years ago, that Edvard Munch in our present time might be a good point of reference for a show that consciously tries to find a painterly stance in our times. And when setting out to do so, we thought it is less about doing an historical exhibition. So we did not want to be a museum. What we said, Edvard Munch is there as one of the big and grand painters of the human condition, and at the same time one of the most innovative colorists we have, maybe next to Henri Matisse in the 20th century. And so we take him as a starting point and see where his traces lead up to the present or up to contemporary painting. If you take a look at the exhibition, we start with Edvard Munch himself. We have very early woodcut by his, and you see a coastal scene, a beach with a cut tree trunk. You feel that is somehow a gloomy atmosphere, a night-like atmosphere. Nonetheless, in bright white, the moon is shining, the light is coming to the shore or towards the land. You see the moon in the sky and see how it might be moving, how it might come up and might go down again. So you're experiencing time passing. So all of a sudden, in this very subtle piece and very simple piece, you're confronted not only with your own place within the world, but even with your own temporality. And so from the beginning of the exhibition with this small piece, you're in the closest moment of a dialogue with yourself. And I think this is one of the greatest strengths he can develop actually in his work, even with a simple small woodcut in black and white. Some people might know that Edvard Munch was one of the earliest painters to experience with photography and cameras, but very few people know that he actually was one of the earliest painters to actually buy the predecessor model of the Super 8 camera. So he was doing films as well. And there you have him in the exhibition, in the entrance, in the front of his house or studio house in Ekely in Norway, near Oslo, standing at the stairs and filming himself. And to some extent, 30 years before Warhol's screen tests, you have Edvard Munch that is actually quite a modern or a contemporary artist, not at all the dusty old 19th century painter that you might associate him with, but actually someone that's quite innovative, and that's someone that's always been sensitive or sensuous towards the real, towards the world around him. And as we have several film stills of his, walking down the stairs towards the camera, trying to adjust it with a slightly tilted head and not really being sure maybe whether the camera is recording or not, and then adjusting it. Some of the image blurred because he disturbs the focus and the image becomes unclear, or sometimes even almost abstract images where you just see the collar of his jacket and some small pockets and his tie. What happens with these filmic tapestry we have in the entrance of the exhibition, you're immediately confronted with Edvard Munch as a person, but he's not the solitary single figure you might see him usually, but he's a multiplied personality. And so that was another aspect we had tried to aim for in this exhibition, not presenting Munch as somebody that's closed off and shut and might be somewhere high upon Mount Olympus of art history, but someone who's approachable. And saying the image we all have of Munch is not one that's limited or reduced to one particular view or one perspective, but it's actually a manifold view. And the perspectives and the connecting points that Munch offers are just as many as there are artists around trying to look at him. So not presenting just one view onto Munch, but opening up, starting from Munch and then multiplying the perspectives was one of the very important aspects we tried to achieve with this exhibition. And coming to some of the pieces in the exhibition, following Munch, the second earliest painting is a very special piece by Oskar Jorn. And this painting we have in the exhibition is called Nailed Down Visions. So fixing something that's actually not to be fixed. And this side of the subconscious or the imagination is of course something that links Jorn with Munch, apart from the obvious painterly approach, the ornamental handling of color, the gestural approach in terms of application or in bringing the color on top of the canvas. And Jorn in particular was a key figure after the war in stating that it's important to claim your own painterly position, to formulate your own painterly voice. Jorn did not take himself into any ideological fightings we had after the war between the East and the West, between America and Russia, for example. But Jorn always claimed this ideal of a painting that stands right in the middle between the ideological blocks and has his own stance. And this is, for example, the next thing that relates him to Georg Baselitz in the exhibition. Baselitz himself has, of course, always dealt with the German tradition of expressionism as one of the roots of his practice, of his starting point. But it is quite crucial not to forget that Georg Baselitz in the 1960s was one of the very few painters who actually said all those ideological systems in the East or the West, out of his own personal experience, they don't lead to any painting that's somehow worthwhile looking at, that a painting still is an expression of an individual experience. An experience of the present and an experience of art history as well as political history, for example. And that was something that Baselitz was crucial for. And in regards to Munch, Baselitz himself always said that Munch is actually the test every young painter should put him or herself to in terms of finding his or her own voice, of getting to the point of trusting your own imagination, trusting your own longings or your own visions, if we take up Jorn's notion now, in terms of coming to your own painting. Finding to yourself, finding your own voice. And that is something that Baselitz quite clearly stated, that Munch definitely undertook this risk as somebody at the beginning of modernism in the early 20th century. Baselitz's massive painting of a huge female figure holding a small child is of course an allegorical painting of the key scene of human existence coming into this world. So the act of creation, painterly wise, is somehow linked to the act of giving birth, of entering. So a very positive painting in that sense. Another crucial position in this exhibition is, in fact, Günther Förg. Günther Förg, in the early 90s, did a series of works, at first in drawing, then in painting, later on even in sculpture, in his bronzes, that explicitly dealt with Edvard Munch. And the funny thing is, and not just the funny thing, but the actually painterly and art historically seen quite important thing, that is a small notion that Förg made. When dealing with the paintings of Edvard Munch, Förg noticed that coming from the motival level of the figures, you always see women, men, children, elderly people in quite existential situations of suffering, of longing, of love, of togetherness. And nonetheless, there is always the feeling that something is off, that Edvard Munch's figures are torn. And Förg now noticed that this existential tornness of the figures of Munch corresponds to the painterly level as well. So if you take a look or closer look at Munch's paintings, you will notice that his grounds, the way how the color is applied, is never uniform. The surfaces are never just one whole. There is always small rips or small fractures in the surface of his canvases where the color seems to break open or it's being ripped apart. And what Förg said is that he found it quite interestingly that this correspondence exists between the inner conflicts of his figures, the being torn apart of the figures in their lives, and the painterly treatment of those scenes and situations, so that the painting of Munch itself is somehow existentially torn. So Förg quite clearly noticed that it's not about color on a canvas, but this color is actually the carrier of human emotions. And this is something that Förg then himself applied into his paintings. And if we take the big late grid painting of his we have in the exhibition, you will see exactly that. Not only is Förg pushing over the rational grid-like structure we know from modernism, so the rectangular composition we find in the 20s and 30s in geometric abstraction, for example. But what he does, he has the stroke and the stroke that's following, so he has the rectangular grids, for example, the structures and the abstract composition and directions of the canvas. But what he does, he tears the fabric of the canvas, and with that he tears the fabric of the painterly reality. So he himself adapted this notion he found in Munch, that the existential crisis is entering color itself, and transported or transmuted it to his own painting. And so when we see a grid painting like that, which is not only in terms of colorism a quite outstanding example, we see again the nearness or the kinship towards Munch, where Förg himself applies basically the teachings of Munch into his own abstract painting, that all of a sudden is far more human or far more physical in that sense that you would usually expect in a painting that on the first glance appears to be abstract. Painting, if it's convincing or trying to be at least sincere, always balances these two poles between figuration and abstraction, between the worldly experience outside and between the painterly experience upon the canvas. So that is something that Baselitz formulated for himself in the 60s, and of course Förg takes that up in the late 70s and 80s, and you see that even, or you not even see it, you even feel and sense it in his paintings from the 2000s or the late 2000s. When we started thinking about the exhibition, we intended, of course, to make an exhibition that shows the history, to enclose the painterly experience of several generations and bring those generations into a conversation with each other. But still, one of the crucial things we wanted to achieve is showing to the public that this is an ongoing thing, so that Munch still is a contemporary, that we're not finished with the issues. As long as we're here, we have all those human issues and all those human dealings with ourselves and the others to come to terms with. And from the younger generation, André Butzer, who was born in 1973, is one of the special examples. His first exhibition was titled I Am Munch, Ich bin Munch. Back then, his first solo show in Vienna. And he always has stated for himself that his main approach was somehow to combine all the extremes of the 20th century. In order to achieve a contemporary painting, he felt the necessity to bring those extremes together. What he did for the last 25 years was basically trying to balance these poles out with with his paintings and in his paintings. And from early on, he brought forth these iconic characters he created. For example, the figure of this confident and strong woman, or the so-called Friedenssiemens, a combination of the ideal of peace on a universal level, combined with the German great industry you had at the earliest 20th century. So again, you see the opposites in his speaking or in his thinking that he's balancing out, as well as, of course, the figure of the wanderer. And if there's something that Butzer learned or took up from Munch, is this approach that painting is an existential thing. Painting is one of the most vulnerable and maybe one of the most sincere forms of human expression that spends all time and combines all differences, all conflicts, all contradictions we are ourselves faced with in reality. Butzer's painting always is linked to this existential question of how to live in the world we're faced with. And I think this is a very positive and very bright example of how this can be achieved without losing on anything, integrating all the conflicts and contradictions, and still coming up with a very bright, very affirmative and lively painting that strongly still implies the contact to Munch and his approach. Ida Ekblad's painting is quite astounding because you never can be sure about your own position. The whole painting is constantly shifting. Your own perspective is constantly shifting, and you cannot be sure whether you're in or you're outside, whether the painting is a massive window and you're right in the middle between stepping outside into nature or being inside, secluded. And maybe the blue and white stripes you see there are blowing curtains, somehow on the boundaries between inside and outside. But looking at the left of this three-part canvas, the blue and white ribbons or lines again just become fragments of color. If you look at the right side, you just see big tears and slips of color, big planes that are somehow gesturally stroked against each other, which just form an abstract composition, so to say. And so you always have the feeling you're shifting, you're looking around, you cannot be certain of the moment, of the present. You're looking and you're encountering the painting, and that is something that relates to Ida Ekblad's praxis as well, because she's not only a painter, she's a sculptor as well, she's a music producer, she's heavily influenced by fashion, media, advertising. So all this modern living or the modern reality enters her painting as well. And like the zooms or like the hard cuts you have in music videos or on your telephone, you might find in her painting as well, because the painting itself is some kind of perceptive instrument for the reality we're faced with. So taking up one of the core questions of Munch, of what is the world we're experiencing outside, and what might our perception of this world be. And the more shifty or sketchy reality gets, our own vision is not the formed and solid one, but it's a shaky and sketchy vision of the world as well. If you remember the painting by Oskar Jorn, the nailed down visions, or the nailed down imaginations or figments of your imagination, in a sense what Ida Ekblad is doing is quite related. You see glimpses like in stroboscopic lightning in her painting, and from these glimpses a kind of mosaic of the present arises. One other of the painters, a Danish painter in the exhibition, is Adam Zucks. And he himself fuses some of the Nordic ornamental tradition with European expressionist painting or American conceptual seriality, the reproducibility of motifs or of different images in his practice, in his paintings. And with different textures of color, in parts thin, in parts thick, and sometimes almost translucent and liquid or fluent, in other parts quite dry or even porous. He's treating color almost in an archaeological way, in terms of that color is not something that's there and applied to the canvas, but color itself has some kind of a temporal quality, so that there are different layers of time within the color and within the motifs he's applying. So in his paintings you will, for example, find elements of still lifes, or as in the painting we have here, you can never be certain whether we see some kind of swirling or swaying landscape in the back, in front of which different body parts are placed, that only at second or third glance reveal themselves not to belong to a closed body, but that are actually fragments themselves, or mask-like. They shift and hover across the painting and still align themselves. So you have these masks that come from maybe African or Polynesian traditions. You've had some kind of ornamentally placed Nordic landscapes impression. You've got the still lifes elements in there. And again, it's the big question of the place of us human beings within nature and within history that come together in his painting. And from the Nordic point of view, that is one of the very lively and very strong painterly positions in the tradition of someone like Munch or Asger Jorn, for example. And so we're very happy to have him included as well. And the same, of course, holds true for the youngest participant in the exhibition, which is Grace Weaver, actually a young American painter in New York. And as we already had it, Munch always achieved to find and formulate, to envision these great depictions or great presentations of human life, or the foremost situation we all experience in our lives of happiness and joy, of grief and loss, of birth as we had it, of death, of losing. And in a sense, as Munch did that at the beginning of the 20th century up into the 1940s, Grace Weaver, on an allegorical level, does in a way the same for her own generation, so for the youngest generation we are faced now artistically. And as our world more and more turns into a digital reality, where we are all detached from each other and rather are looking at a digital screen on a computer or on our phones, in a way, for this endless scrolling of images we have on those digital devices, Grace Weaver is to some extent trying to find images for these experiences of her own generation. And the painting we see here, we see at least two women at a bar. It's a very gloomy place, some orange, yellow light in the back or in the top are lighting the space. The people themselves, or the women, are completely out of contact with each other. They're close in terms of the place, but still everyone is secluded for herself, rather sunken into herself than being in an open communication with each other. And so this painting of this bar scene rather appears to be some kind of a waiting room for something nobody can clearly formulate. And so quite closely, although different in painting to Munch, Grace Weaver's position in contemporary painting or in figurative painting works exactly on this allegorical level. So this is actually, if you take just exemplary paintings in the exhibition, some of the glimpses we have, and that strongly show that Munch speaks really through the generation and has always spoken as a painter and a painterly position up to now. Particularly as the exhibition is set up as a dialogue throughout 150 years, so to say, that this is a still ongoing thing. We're not finished thinking about who we are or who we want to be. And of course that's clear, just as the film stills in the beginning of the exhibition, the answers are always many. And there's never just only one perspective. And even though we made quite a clear selection in the artists we present or we show now, still we hope to transport the message that the perspectives always need to be multiple, that there can actually be a conversation. And this exhibition actually is something that's directed towards the future. And hopefully painting can still be a sign of human existence, or can formulate signs, different forms of human existence, and in accordance help us deal with the life we're living or we're faced with.